He spent 12 years making sure no one could reach him. Then she arrived, and he realized the mountain wasn't protecting him. It was burying him alive. If you've ever built walls so high you forgot what it felt like to let someone in, this story is for you. Stay until the end. Drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach was 40 minutes late, which didn't surprise Rowan Blackridge at all. Nothing about that day had gone the way it was supposed to. He'd woken before dawn to find one of his fence posts had collapsed under the weight of early frost, leaving a gap in the eastern pasture wide enough for cattle to wander through. He'd spent the better part of the morning hammering iron stakes into half-frozen ground, alone, the way he did everything. By the time he hitched the wagon and drove the 7 miles down into Caldwell Creek, his boots were caked with mud. His coat smelled like a working man's coat should smell, and he was in precisely the mood he was always in when forced to interact with the town. Tolerant, mostly silent, and counting the minutes until he could leave. He stood at the edge of the depot platform with his arms crossed and his hat pulled low against the October wind. Around him a handful of people waited, a merchant's wife in a wool coat, an older man dozing on a bench, 2 ranch hands sharing a cigarette near the water barrel. None of them paid Rowan much attention, and he returned the favor. The stagecoach appeared at the far end of Caldwell Creek's main road in a cloud of kicked-up dust, its horses blowing hard from the long haul through the pass. The driver hauled back on the reins with a grunt of effort, and the whole rig shuddered to a stop at the depot steps. 3 passengers stepped out. A heavy-set salesman with a sample case, a young couple who immediately began arguing about something in hushed, tight voices. And then, a woman, alone. She stepped down from the coach carefully, both hands gripping the door frame, and Rowan watched her without meaning to. She was somewhere in her mid-30s, he guessed. Not a girl. A woman who'd had a life already, you could tell that much from the way she moved. Measured, deliberate, like someone who'd learned not to waste motion. Her dress was dark blue and plain, her hair was pinned up under a traveling hat that had seen better days. She carried a single worn suitcase, the leather cracked at the corners, a piece of twine knotted around the latch, where the clasp had given out. She set the suitcase down on the platform and looked around the depot with calm, searching eyes. Then her gaze found Rowan, and she walked straight toward him. "Mr. Blackridge?" she said. Her voice was quieter than he expected. Not timid, just low, like someone who didn't raise her voice because she'd learned that people who needed to shout rarely had anything worth hearing. "That's me," he said. "Evelyn Hart." She extended her hand. He shook it. Her grip was firm. Her hands were not soft. There was a pause that probably lasted only 2 or 3 seconds, but felt considerably longer. "Wagon's over here," Rowan said, and turned and walked toward it. She picked up her suitcase and followed without comment. Well, that was how it began. Not with flowers. Not with the nervous, hopeful conversation you'd expect between 2 strangers about to attempt a life together. Just a man walking to a wagon and a woman following, both of them carrying a weight that had nothing to do with luggage. The drive back up to Frost Ridge took the better part of 2 hours, and they spent most of it in silence. Rowan kept his eyes on the road, which required genuine attention. The mountain trail was narrow and uneven, with switchbacks cut into the rock face and drop-offs on the left side that the first snow of the season had already made treacherous. The horses knew the way well enough, but a man could still come to grief if he stopped paying attention. At least, that was what he told himself. The truth was simpler. He didn't know what to say to her. He'd placed the advertisement because it was practical. Because another winter was coming, and running a mountain ranch alone was getting harder to manage, not easier, and he was 39 years old and too tired to pretend otherwise. He needed help. He was willing to provide stability, a roof, food, the legal security of a name. That was the arrangement. He'd been clear about it in the advertisement, and apparently she'd been clear-eyed about it in her response, because she was here. What he hadn't counted on was the specific weight of having another person sitting 2 feet away from him in the wagon, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes moving quietly over the mountain terrain like she was cataloging it. "It's steeper than I expected," she said, somewhere around the 3rd mile. "It gets steeper," he said. Another silence. "I read your advertisement 3 times," she said. "You were very honest in it." Seemed like the right approach. It was. She looked at him for a moment, then back at the trail. "I appreciated it." He wasn't sure how to respond to that, so he said nothing. The wagon climbed. Frost Ridge sat at just over 6,000 feet, on a broad shelf of mountain cut by a cold creek, and sheltered on the north side by a rock face that had been there since before anyone alive could remember. The land was hard. Rocky soil, short summers, winters that came early and stayed late, and didn't apologize for either. The timber was dense on the eastern slope, opening into pasture toward the south, where Rowan ran his small herd of cattle. The cabin itself was big by mountain standards. 2 rooms originally, with a third added on sometime in the previous decade by the man Rowan had bought the property from. It was built from pine logs and river stone, low to the ground and solid, the kind of structure that had been put together by someone who understood that beauty was irrelevant and durability was everything. It was not a comfortable-looking place. Rowan knew that. He watched Evelyn's face as the wagon came around the last bend and the cabin came into view. She looked at it for a long moment without speaking. "It's sturdy," she said finally. "It is." "The roof looks sound. Replaced the eastern section 2 summers ago." She nodded slowly, still studying the cabin with those quiet eyes of hers. Whatever she thought about it, she kept it to herself. That was something, he supposed. He'd half expected dismay, some flash of second-guessing behind the eyes. Instead, she just climbed down from the wagon before he could come around to help her, lifted her suitcase, and walked toward the front door. He stood there for a moment watching her go, and felt something shift in his chest. Not much, just a slight, uncomfortable movement, like a stone settling in a dry creek bed. He unhitched the horses and put them up. Inside, the cabin was warm from the fire Rowan had banked before leaving that morning. The main room served as both kitchen and living space. A plank table, 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, shelves of dry goods along one wall, a stone fireplace along the other. There was nothing on the walls except a single horseshoe nailed above the door and a calendar from 2 years ago that he'd never taken down. Evelyn set her suitcase down just inside the door and stood very still for a moment, looking at the room. Rowan came in behind her and hung his coat on the peg. "The bedroom's through there," he said, nodding toward the door at the back. "I moved my things out. You'll have it to yourself." She turned and looked at him. "Where will you sleep?" "There's a cot in the supply room." "Mr. Blackridge?" "It's not a problem," he said. "I've slept on worse." She looked like she wanted to say something about that, but she didn't. She just nodded once, that same careful, measured nod he was already starting to recognize, and turned back to the room. "May I see the kitchen supplies?" she asked. "Go ahead." She moved to the shelves with a practicality that surprised him, scanning the stores with her eyes moving quickly, her lips pressed together in a way that suggested she was doing inventory in her head. She checked the flour, the salt, the dried beans, the coffee. She opened the icebox and looked inside. She checked the firewood stacked near the stove. "You're low on lamp oil," she said. "I know. I was going to get it in town." "The flour has bugs." He stopped. "What?" "Not badly, just at the top." She showed him, sure enough, a faint movement in the flour barrel. "If you seal it properly and use the affected portion first, it won't spread. It's still edible." Rowan looked at the barrel, then at her. "Didn't notice that." "Easy to miss." No judgment in her voice, just a statement. He nodded slowly. "I'll get to it." She turned back to the shelves. "I'll take care of supper." That was the end of the first conversation they ever had about anything that mattered. She made corn cakes and salt pork, which was about what the supplies allowed for, and they ate at the plank table with the fire going and the wind beginning to pick up outside. The silence between them was not hostile. It was just large. 2 people who didn't know each other sitting in a small cabin on a dark mountain, sharing a meal they hadn't chosen to share. Rowan ate quickly, the way a man eats when he's used to eating alone and has forgotten the social obligation of pace. He caught himself doing it and slowed down, which was its own kind of awkward. "Good," he said, meaning the corn cakes. "Thank you." She took a sip of water. "Where did you come from originally?" The advertisement didn't say. "Eastern Montana. You?" "Ohio, a town called Weston." "Long way to come." "Yes." She set down her fork. "My husband died 14 months ago. There wasn't much left for me in Weston after that." The directness of it caught him off guard. Most people worked up to that kind of information slowly, built fences around it first. She just said it plain, the way you'd state a fact about the weather. I'm sorry, he said. Thank you. A pause. And you? The advertisement mentioned you'd been here 12 years. That's right. He waited for the follow-up question, the natural next one. What brought you here? What made you stay? Were you ever married? But it didn't come. She just went back to eating, and he realized she was giving him space. Not pushing, not probing, just leaving a door open and not standing in the frame. He didn't walk through it. Not that night. After supper, she washed the dishes without being asked, set them on the shelf with a precision that suggested she was organizing them slightly differently than they'd been before, and then said goodnight and went to bed. Rowan sat by the fire for a long time afterward, listening to the wind work at the roof and thinking about nothing in particular, which was what he usually did on winter evenings. Except that tonight, for the first time in longer than he could remember, the silence in the cabin felt different. Not worse, just different, like a room with the furniture rearranged. Same room, different weight to it. But the first week was a careful edging thing. They established a rhythm without discussing it, the way practical people do. Rowan was up before dawn, out to the animals, back in for coffee, then off to whatever the day's work demanded. Evelyn had coffee ready when he came back from the barn, which he hadn't asked for and didn't comment on, though he noticed it. She took charge of the cabin, cooking, cleaning, managing the stores with a careful economy that spoke of someone who'd learned not to waste. She didn't ask permission for the things she changed. She just changed them. The flour barrel was sealed and repositioned. The lamp wicks were trimmed. The firewood was restacked in a pattern that he had to admit privately was more efficient than his own. When she found a crack in the chinking between two logs near the north window, a crack that had been letting in cold air all morning, she packed it herself with a mixture of ash and pine pitch she'd figured out from a reference book he hadn't known he owned. He found the dried patch that evening and ran his fingers over it. "That'll hold," he said. "I think so." She didn't look up from the pot she was stirring. "Where'd you learn that?" "My husband's house was old. Things needed fixing." A brief pause. He wasn't much for fixing things. Rowan said nothing to that. He pulled up a chair and sat and drank his coffee and watched the fire. After a while, Evelyn said, without looking up, "You don't have to talk to me, Mr. Blackridge." "I know. I just mean, I'm not going to take it personally. I understand this is an arrangement, not a—" She trailed off, then found her footing again. "I'm not expecting anything I didn't agree to." He looked at her then, at the back of her head, the careful way she moved over the stove. "What did you agree to?" he said. She turned and met his eyes. In the firelight, she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the work. "A fair chance," she said, "at something quiet." He nodded once. "That I can manage." "I know," she said. "That's why I came." But there were small collisions in those early days. Not arguments, exactly. Friction. He had his way of doing things. Most of them the result of 12 years of solitary routine, which meant they were efficient but not flexible. He stacked his tools in a specific order. He fed the animals at specific times. He took his boots off at the door. He did not tolerate open containers near the supply shelf because once, years ago, a jar of oil had tipped and ruined a winter's worth of salt. Evelyn learned these rules by breaking them, occasionally. The first time she moved his splitting axe to a different peg in the barn, he brought it back without saying anything and hung it where it belonged. She noticed. The second time, the axe stayed where she'd moved it. He noticed. Neither of them said anything. The second week, she reorganized the supply shelf. Not dramatically, just pulled things forward so the older stores were in front, the newer ones in back. Standard pantry logic. Rowan stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a moment, looking at it. "I would have preferred you asked first," he said. She turned from the shelf. "You're right, I should have." No defensiveness, no explanation, just an acknowledgement. He stood there for a moment, somewhat disarmed by the lack of argument, then nodded and went back outside. That evening he told her where the extra lamp oil was stored, and where he kept the winter tools, and what the rule was about the oil jar, and why. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Thank you for telling me. It was a strange thing, being thanked for that." He turned it over in his mind later, out in the barn, running a brush along the flank of the older of his two horses. "I don't know what I'm doing, Sadie," he told the horse. Sadie stamped one foot and swished her tail. Yeah, he said. I know. Come on. The cold settled in properly during the third week. Not the early frost that had been nipping at the mornings, but real cold. The kind that had weight to it, that pushed down from the north and made the creek slow and the pine trees groan at night. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in a single afternoon, and by evening a hard wind was moving across the ridge with a sound like something angry. Rowan spent the day reinforcing the barn, plugging gaps, adding insulation around the water trough, checking that the latch on the main door would hold against a sustained blow. He came inside after dark, later than usual, and found Evelyn had already shifted their supper preparations to account for the cold snap. She'd moved a second layer of blankets from the supply room to the bedroom. She'd set extra firewood inside. She'd checked the chimney draw. Good thinking, he said, looking around at all of it. I watched the weather all day, she said, the way the clouds were stacking up. You read weather? I learned to. She set a bowl of bean soup in front of him. In Ohio, winters could turn fast. You had to pay attention. He sat and wrapped both hands around the bowl, letting the warmth seep into his palms. Outside, the wind was going hard against the walls, finding every small weakness in the structure and worrying at it. How bad does it get up here? She asked. She was sitting across from him, eating her own soup, watching him with those steady eyes. Depends on the year. He looked at the fire. Some years it's just cold and long. Some years it gets mean. And this year? He considered. Don't know yet, but that wind out there. He tilted his head toward the sound. That's not an early wind. That's the real thing. She was quiet for a moment, then, I can handle cold. I figured, he said, which was, for Rowan Blackridge, practically a compliment. She started talking to the horses. He noticed this about a week in, coming back to the barn earlier than expected one afternoon. He could hear her voice before he opened the door. Low and even, not quite singing, not quite talking, somewhere in between. Sadie and the other horse, a younger brown gelding named Buck, were both watching her with the particular alert interest horses show when they've decided they like someone. She was brushing Sadie's neck and talking to her the way you'd talk to a person. Explaining things, the weather, the state of the stores, some opinion she'd apparently formed about the way the woodpile was arranged. Rowan stood in the doorway and listened for a moment without announcing himself. Don't think he knows what to do with someone who doesn't argue back, Evelyn was saying to the horse. I've noticed he prepares for pushback that doesn't come, and then doesn't know what to do with himself. A pause, during which Sadie made a soft noise. I know. I think it's interesting, too. Rowan stepped back from the doorway and made more noise approaching this time. When he came in, Evelyn was brushing Sadie with an expression of complete calm, as if she hadn't just been conducting a conversation about him with a horse. She likes being brushed on the left side more than the right, Evelyn said. He stopped, looked at Sadie. How'd you figure that? She leans into it on the left. On the right, she shifts away slightly. He'd had that horse for 9 years and never noticed. Huh, he said. He took the other brush and started on Buck, and for a few minutes they worked in parallel in the warm, hay-smelling dark of the barn. And it was not comfortable exactly. Not yet. But it was something. Something that wasn't quite silence anymore, even when neither of them was speaking. The end of the third week brought the first real test. Rowan had gone out to check the eastern fence line, the same one that had given him trouble the day Evelyn arrived, because the wind the night before had been bad enough that he wanted to make sure nothing else had come down. It was a 2-hour ride out and back, nothing unusual. He told Evelyn he'd be back by early afternoon. He wasn't. The fence was worse than he'd expected. Not one post but 4 had shifted, and a section of wire had snapped and coiled back into the snow. If he left it, he'd lose cattle. He stayed to work on it, which took longer than expected because the ground in that stretch was rockier than elsewhere, and the frost had made it brutal to work with. By the time he finished, the light was going flat and gray. He rode back faster than he should have, pushing Buck harder than was wise on icy trail, and came around the bend above the cabin to find smoke rising properly from both the main chimney and the kitchen stack, and Evelyn standing on the porch looking up the trail with her arms crossed, and her face showing something that was not quite fear and not quite anger, but sat uncomfortably between the two. When she saw him come around the bend, she stood up straighter, and whatever had been on her face smoothed itself away. But he'd seen it. He rode in and unsaddled Buck in the barn. When he came inside, his hands stiff with cold and his back aching from 3 hours of working fence in a crouch, Evelyn was at the stove. There was hot coffee waiting. There was supper further along than it should have been for this hour, which meant she'd started it early, maybe an hour ago, which meant she'd been watching that trail for at least that long. Fence was worse than I thought, he said, dropping into his chair. I figured, she said. She poured the coffee and set it in front of him. She didn't say I was worried, or next time tell me if you're going to be late, or any of the dozen variations of reproach that his life experience suggested were coming. She just went back to the stove. He drank the coffee and felt the warmth move through him and watched her back and thought about the expression he'd seen on her face on the porch, the way she'd been standing, the set of her shoulders. I should have sent word, he said. She was quiet for a moment. There's no one to send it with. I know, but I should have said how long it might take. She turned from the stove and looked at him. Her eyes were steady, but there was something in them, something careful and small and human. Yes, she said. You should have. It was the first real thing either of them had said to the other. Not good fence work or the flowers fine now or weather's coming. An actual thing. Rowan nodded and looked at his coffee. I'll do that, he said. Going forward. She turned back to the stove. Thank you. November arrived like a door swinging shut. The snow came not gradually but in slabs. Big, heavy falls that stacked up a foot at a time, that built drifts against the cabin walls and the barn doors and the north fence until the landscape turned white and muffled and unrecognizable. The world shrank to the cabin, the barn, the short path between them that Rowan cleared each morning and that filled back in overnight. The road down to Caldwell Creek was buried. There was no going to town. There was no going anywhere. There was only Frost Ridge, the two of them, and winter. In a strange way, the isolation simplified things. Evelyn had no choice but to master the cabin's rhythms. She had nothing else to do and nowhere else to be. She learned how the stove liked to be fed in cold weather, which was differently than in mild weather. She learned that the water bucket near the back door froze solid overnight and needed to be brought inside. She learned which of the supply shelves was coldest and rearranged accordingly. She learned the sounds the cabin made, the specific creak of the north wall when the temperature dropped below a certain point, the way the chimney whined when the wind came from the east. Rowan watched her learn all of this with a feeling he couldn't entirely name. It wasn't admiration exactly, or it wasn't only that. It was more like recognition, the way you feel when you realize someone else has understood something true. She was adapting, not pretending to adapt, not performing competence for his benefit, but actually absorbing the mountain's language and responding to it. He started talking more, not a lot. Not in any way that would have struck a neutral observer as remarkable. But by the second week of November, he was telling her things without being asked. Where the dead spots in the pasture were, which trail got icy first, that the creek froze loudly and not to be alarmed by it. Practical things. Mountain things. Information she'd need. She listened to all of it with complete attention, which was unnerving in its own way. Rowan was not accustomed to being listened to. 12 years of talking mostly to horses and cattle had eroded any expectation of that. You're teaching me, she said one evening over supper. Just telling you things you should know. That's what teaching is. She took a bite of her food. Thank you. He looked at his plate. You pick things up fast. I've always been good at that. A pause. It was the one thing my husband used to say. He said I was too quick, that it made him feel slow. She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said everything, but there was something under the words that he caught. He was quiet for a moment. That's a strange complaint. Yes, she said. It was. There was an evening in the third week of November that Rowan would think about later, when he was trying to place the precise point at which things began to change. He'd come in late from the barn. One of the cattle had been off all day, moving strange, and he'd stayed with her until he was satisfied she wasn't going to get worse. He was tired in a bone-deep way, the kind that comes from cold and worry and too many hours on his feet. He came through the door and Evelyn was at the table with one of his reference books open in front of her, a cup of tea going cold beside her elbow, reading by lamplight. She looked up when he came in. The heifer? She said. She'll be okay. She'd got something in her hoof. I got it out. Good. She watched him peel off his coat, his movements stiff and slow. Sit down, I'll heat something. He sat. She put soup on the stove and came back to the table and sat across from him, and for a while neither of them spoke. The fire was going well. The wind outside was doing its winter thing, restless and low. My wife's name was Clara, Rowan said. He hadn't meant to say it, or rather, he'd been carrying it around all evening in the way you carry something heavy until you set it down without meaning to. Not because the moment is right, but because your arms finally give out. Evelyn didn't say anything, just looked at him with those calm eyes. She died 8 years into our marriage, he said. Not here. Back in Montana. We were going to come here together. I'd bought this land already. She never saw it. He looked at the fire. Fever. 3 days and she was gone. Wasn't anything to be done about it. A long quiet. I'm sorry, Evelyn said. Not in the reflexive, social way. In the way of someone who actually meant it. It was a long time ago. He picked up his coffee cup, which was empty. I came here anyway. Figured I'd already bought the place. But you stayed. Easier than going back. She was quiet for a moment, then. My husband, Thomas. I don't think he ever saw me. She said it slowly, choosing her words carefully. Not as a lack of love. I don't want to be unfair, but I spent 17 years in that house being quite invisible, keeping things running, making sure everything worked, and never... She stopped, started again. No one knew what I could do, because there was never any reason for anyone to know. Rowan looked at her. That sounds lonely, he said. It was. She met his eyes, though I imagine yours was worse. Different, he said. Not worse. She considered that, nodded slightly. Outside, the wind shifted, a low rolling sound across the ridge that was almost musical if you were in the right frame of mind. The soup on the stove began to simmer. I think, Evelyn said, that I have spent a great deal of my life being very competent in rooms where no one was watching. Rowan looked at her for a long moment, then carefully, I'm watching. She looked at him. Something in her face shifted, barely visible, like the first crack in ice, there and then contained. She nodded once. I know, she said. That's the strangest part about being here. She got up to tend to the soup, and Rowan sat by the fire, and neither of them said anything else. And somehow the silence was a completely different weight than it had been an hour ago. He found her crying once. He hadn't meant to. Had come back to the cabin for a tool he'd forgotten and opened the door quietly out of long habit. She was standing at the kitchen window with her back to him, one hand pressed flat against the cold glass, looking out at the white silence of the mountain. Her shoulders were moving in that small, careful way of someone who is trying to cry quietly. He stood in the doorway. She heard him and turned, and he saw her face. Not broken, not falling apart, just carrying something too heavy for a moment. She pressed her fingers briefly to her eyes and straightened. I'm sorry, she said. She stopped. Sometimes the size of it gets to me. The mountain, the quiet. He didn't say it's fine or don't apologize or any of the things that would have been easy and wrong. He went to the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee. Brought one to her. She took it. Their fingers almost touched. Tell me about Ohio, he said. She blinked. What? Ohio, tell me about it, what it looked like. What you did there. What? She looked at him for a moment, searching his face for something, and then she pulled out a chair and sat down and began to talk. She talked about the flat land and the way the sky sat low on the horizon in winter. She talked about the house she'd grown up in, which had a porch that wrapped around 2 sides and a maple tree that turned a color in autumn she'd never been able to describe properly. She talked about her mother, who had been good with a garden, but bad with money. She talked about the school where she'd learned enough law from a neighbor's borrowed books to understand more than anyone around her ever suspected. Rowan sat across from her and listened. He didn't say much, didn't need to. But he was there, and he was paying attention, and after a while the tightness went out of her shoulders, and her voice found its natural rhythm, and outside the mountain stood cold and still and enormous, and inside the cabin it was warm enough. December came in behind a wall of dark cloud. The temperature dropped to levels that made breath come in thick clouds, and the water in the trough freeze solid overnight, regardless of what you did about it. The days were short and gray and tasted of iron. The cattle needed more attention. The woodpile needed constant replenishing. Rowan and Evelyn had been on the mountain together for nearly 2 months. They had, without planning it or naming it, built a life. Small and provisional and full of unspoken things, but a life nonetheless. They ate together. They worked in rough partnership, taking up the tasks best suited to each of them without the need for much discussion. He maintained the property and the animals. She ran the cabin with a competence that had long since passed from impressive to simply assumed. She had stopped asking him before she rearranged things. He had stopped noticing the rearrangements, which was its own kind of progress. They talked more than they had. Not always about important things, often about small things, the behavior of the cattle, the state of the wood supply, things she'd been reading in the reference books, observations she'd made about the mountain's patterns. But sometimes, on long evenings by the fire, the conversation went deeper, and they let it. He told her about his early years in Montana, the cattle drives, the other men he'd worked with, the life he'd thought he was building before the fever came and took Clara and left him standing in the wreckage of a future that hadn't been finished yet. She told him about Thomas, about the particular exhaustion of being married to someone who was not unkind but who was absent in all the ways that mattered, about learning to ask nothing, to need nothing, to reduce herself to fit the space she'd been given. "You were good at disappearing," Rowan said one evening. "Excellent at it." She looked at her hands. "I got here and thought, I don't even know how to take up space anymore. I'd been making myself small for so long." "You don't seem small," he said. She looked at him. "You seem," he said slowly, "like someone who figured out how to be big again, quietly, without making a big deal of it." She stared at him for a long moment. Then she laughed. A real laugh, a surprised one, the kind that sneaks out before you can decide whether to let it. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh. He realized he'd been waiting to hear it without knowing he was. It was the 14th of December when he went out in the storm. He shouldn't have. Evelyn said so, not in those words, but in the way she stood at the door watching him, her arms crossed, her jaw set. "One of the calves is down in the east pasture," he said, pulling on his heaviest coat. "In this weather, she won't last the night." "Can she be moved?" "Not without someone going to get her." Evelyn looked at the sky. The storm was moving in from the northwest, low and fast, the kind of weather that erased landmarks and made a man walk in circles. "It's going to get worse," she said. "I know the east pasture better than this mountain knows itself," he said. "I'll be 2 hours." She looked at him with those eyes, not afraid exactly, but something related to it, something that lived in the same territory. "2 hours," she said. He went. He was 4 hours. The calf was down, as he'd known she would be, half buried in a drift at the low end of the pasture. He got her moving. It was hard, slow, miserable work, pushing the animal through drifts while the wind built to something close to a howl. He got her to the barn. He was on his way back to the cabin when the ground shifted under his left boot on a patch of ice at the base of the porch steps, and he went down, hard. He caught himself on his hands. No damage. But in catching himself, he twisted, and something in his right shoulder screamed in a way that told him he'd done it real harm. He got up, walked inside. Evelyn was at the table with her hands flat on the surface and her face as still as stone. She looked at him, and her eyes went straight to the way he was holding his arm. "Sit," she said, and her voice was different, not harsh, but very precise, stripped of everything soft. "I'm fine." "Sit down, Rowan." He stopped. It was the first time she'd used his first name. He sat. She came around the table and stood beside him and took his arm with both hands, feeling along his shoulder with a deliberateness that told him she'd done this before. He set his jaw against the pain. "You separated it," she said. "Maybe. Or stretched it very badly. I can't be sure without—" She pressed carefully, and he caught his breath in spite of himself. "Hold still." "I know," he said, through his teeth. "This is going to hurt," she said. "A lot, for about 30 seconds. He looked at her. "What are you—" "It hurt. A lot. For about 30 seconds. Then his shoulder settled back into something approximating its right position, and the sharp edge of the pain dropped to a deep, heavy ache that was still bad but manageable. He sat very still, breathing. "Where did you learn that?" he said when he trusted his voice again. "Thomas had a shoulder that went out every winter. The doctor showed me." She began wrapping the joint with a length of cloth she'd had ready. He realized she'd had it ready, cut and folded, waiting. "You need to keep this immobile for at least 3 days." "I can't, Rowan." She looked at him directly. 3 days. "Or it'll keep separating. I've seen it." He looked at the wrapped shoulder, then at her. "You had that cloth ready," he said. "You were 4 hours," she said. "I had time to think." He was quiet for a moment. "You were scared." She met his eyes. "Yes," she said simply. "I was." He sat in the chair with his wrapped shoulder and the fire going and the storm battering the walls of the cabin, and looked at the woman who had cut strips of cloth and waited for him in the dark, and felt something move in his chest that was bigger and more frightening than a separated shoulder. He didn't have a name for it yet, but it was there. His shoulder kept him inside for 5 days. He hated it, every hour of it. He was not built for stillness, had never been, and the enforced confinement in the cabin while the storm played out, and then another began, was a particular kind of slow misery. He couldn't chop wood. He couldn't lift anything substantial. He couldn't do the dozen things that the ranch demanded, and that, in their absence, sat in the back of his mind like an unpaid debt. Evelyn did them. Not all of them. She couldn't move the heavy timber or manage certain of the larger animals alone. But she did what could be done, and she did it without comment or complaint, coming and going in her coat and boots, clearing the paths, feeding the cattle, checking the fences in the areas closest to the cabin. She came back cold and windburned and went directly to the stove to warm her hands, and then started on supper as if it were nothing. He watched all of it from his chair by the fire, which was its own discomfort. "You don't have to do all that," he said, on the second day. "I know," she said. "I mean, Rowan." She turned from the stove. "I'm aware I don't have to. I want to. There's a difference." He was quiet. "You'd do the same," she said, turning back. "If the positions were reversed." He thought about it. "Yes," he said. "I would." "Then let me." He let her. On the 4th evening, when his shoulder was mending and he was restless enough to be genuinely difficult, she sat across from him by the fire and read to him from one of the reference books. Not agricultural information, but a section she'd found on the geology of the mountains, which was not particularly compelling as subject matter, but which she read well, with a voice that knew how to pace itself, and he found himself not listening to the words exactly, but to the sound of them, the way they filled the cabin. He thought, I could listen to that for a long time. He thought, that's a dangerous thing to think. He thought about Clara. Not painfully, not with the old ache, but gently, the way you handle something you've been carrying for years and have finally learned the weight of. Clara, who had been quick and bright and gone in 3 days, and who had taught him without meaning to that love was just another thing the world could take from you. He looked at Evelyn reading by the fire, her hair coming loose from its pins, her feet tucked under her because the floor was cold, and felt the fear that came with that observation like a physical thing, a tightening in the chest, a cold edge. And then, quietly, underneath the fear, something that refused to go away, something stubborn and alive, and entirely its own. Outside, the snow kept coming. The mountain stood in its cold silence. And inside the cabin on Frost Ridge, 2 people who had arrived at the same place carrying different damage sat by a fire and quietly, without ceremony or intention, became something to each other. Walt, on the 5th day, his shoulder was well enough to work. He was up before dawn, moving carefully, testing the joint. It held. He got his coat and went out to the barn, and when he came back, Evelyn had coffee ready and was standing at the window watching the sky. "Clear today?" she said. "For now." She poured his coffee and handed it to him, and their fingers touched this time, briefly, and neither of them pulled away immediately. He looked at her. She looked at him. "I'll check the east fence today," he said. "I'll have supper ready when you're back," she said. He drank his coffee. He put on his hat. He went out into the cold December morning with the sound of her moving in the kitchen behind him, And for the first time in 12 years, going out to work didn't feel like something a man did to fill the silence. It felt like something a man did because there was something worth coming back to. The east fence held. Rowan walked the line for 2 miles that December morning, testing each post with his good arm, checking the wire for breaks, reading the ground for signs of drift damage. The shoulder ached in the cold, but it held together, and the fence held together, and by the time he came back over the ridge with Buck moving steady beneath him, the sun had climbed enough to put a weak yellow light across the snow that almost looked like warmth. Almost. He rode into the barn and found that Evelyn had already been there that morning. The water trough had been broken open. She'd chipped through the overnight ice with the hand axe, which meant she'd been up earlier than him, which unsettled him slightly. He hung Buck's saddle and stood there a moment looking at the broken ice, thin gray chips scattered on the barn floor, and thought about a woman who got up before dawn to chip ice in a barn because it needed doing and she was the one there to do it. He went inside and didn't say anything about it. She didn't either. That was December, and they moved through it the way the mountain moved through weather. Not gracefully, not without cost, but forward, always forward. The cold deepened in the days after Christmas into something that stopped being a season and became more like a condition, a permanent state of the world in which warmth was theoretical and ice was the only honest material. The snow on the north side of the cabin was banked above the window line. The trail to the barn was a channel cut through white walls. Every morning, Rowan dug it out again, and every night the cold filled it back in, and this was the rhythm of January on Frost Ridge, had always been. And you either made your peace with it, or you left. Evelyn made her peace with it. He watched her do it and couldn't entirely say how. She didn't fight the mountains. She accommodated it, bent around it the way water bends around stone. She moved slower on cold mornings, saved her heavier work for midday when the temperature rose a degree or two, arranged her tasks to minimize time outside. She wore 2 of everything and didn't complain about the cold, but sometimes he'd catch her standing at the stove with both palms flat on the iron surface, eyes closed, just taking the warmth in. He didn't say anything on those occasions, just made sure the fire stayed banked. There were hard days. He'd be a liar to pretend otherwise. There was a Tuesday in early January when the temperature dropped so fast and so far that 3 of his cattle needed to be brought into the barn, which meant reorganizing the whole space, moving equipment, putting down extra hay, and doing it all in a wind that had teeth. It was heavy work, and there was too much of it, and by the end of the afternoon, Rowan was running short on patience in the way that cold and exhaustion combined to produce. A tightness behind the eyes, a brittleness in the voice, everything too close to the surface. He came inside and found Evelyn in the middle of reorganizing the supply shelf again. Not the small adjustments she'd been making for weeks. A full reorganization. Cans pulled out and sorted, sacks restacked, a whole system apparently in progress. He stood in the doorway and looked at it. "What's this?" "I'm separating things by how often we use them," she said, not turning around. "The things we need daily shouldn't be behind the things we need monthly. It doesn't make sense the way it was." "It made sense to me. You knew where everything was because you put it there. I have to search every time." He pulled off his coat and hung it, harder than necessary. "I've had that shelf a certain way for 9 years. She turned then. She looked at him, at his face, his posture, the stiff set of his jaw, and she did something that surprised him. She stopped what she was doing and she said quite directly, "You've had a bad afternoon." It wasn't a question, and it wasn't soft, and it wasn't picking a fight either. It was just accurate. He stood there. "Yes," he said. "Sit down." "I don't need to, Rowan, sit." He sat. She put coffee on. She finished with the shelf in about 10 minutes, moving efficiently, and then she set a cup in front of him and sat across the table, and they were quiet for a while. Outside, the wind moved over the roof with a low, sustained moan. "3 of the cattle are in the barn," he said. "I know. I saw you bring them in from the window. If this cold holds another week, the hay won't last." "How much short?" "Maybe not short. Maybe fine. I don't know yet." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "What can I do?" He looked at her. The question was so plain. What can I do? Not is there anything I can help with, not let me know if you need anything. The soft offers that don't require follow-through. Just, what can I do? "Nothing yet," he said. But I'll tell you if that changes." "All right." She drank her coffee. He drank his. The shelf behind her was better organized than it had been. He could see that clearly from where he sat. Things grouped by logic, the frequently used items forward. He thought about 9 years of reaching past the things he needed to get the things he needed, and had simply never thought to change it. "The shelf is better," he said. She looked at him over her cup. "I know." Something moved in his chest that might have been the beginning of a smile, if he'd been a different kind of man, or if the afternoon hadn't been what it was. He didn't smile, but it was there. January ground on. The hay held. The cattle in the barn needed extra attention, mucking, feeding, watching for the respiratory problems that cold and close quarters encouraged. Evelyn took the morning watch, and Rowan took the evening, which meant he was often in the barn after dark, listening to the animals settle, thinking his particular brand of thoughts. Slow thoughts, mostly. The kind that don't go anywhere but need somewhere to go. He thought about Evelyn more than he should. Not in any scandalous way. Just in the way that a person takes up space in your mind when they've taken up space in your life. The small things she did. The way she tucked her chin when she was concentrating. The way she spoke to the horses. The specific sound of her boots on the cabin floor in the morning when he was still half asleep and everything was quiet. The way she could hold a silence without needing to fill it. The way she had looked at him when he came in late from the east fence, standing at the door, afraid. He'd been alone for a long time. He'd gotten good at it. He'd convinced himself he preferred it. He sat with the cattle in the cold barn and tried to remember the last time he'd thought about another person this much and couldn't find it. And that fact sat in his chest like the wrong kind of stone. He was not a man who believed in fighting something he couldn't win. He was, however, a man who believed in being careful. And so he was careful, with himself, with the distance he kept, with the space between sitting across a table and sitting too close to one. He didn't always succeed at careful. There was an evening in the second week of January when they were both in the kitchen after supper, Rowan at the table with the account book, Evelyn doing something at the counter that involved dried herbs and a mortar she'd found in the supply room and apparently decided was hers now. The fire was going well. The lamp was low, the way it got when the oil was running down, and the light in the room was warm and unsteady. He looked up from the account book and she was turned toward him slightly, half her face in the light, working the mortar with a rhythm that was automatic, her mind somewhere else. He could see she'd been thinking about something for a while. There was a quality to her stillness when she was working through a problem, a particular inwardness. "What is it?" he said. She blinked and came back. "What?" "You've been thinking something for about an hour." She looked at him. Then she set down the pestle and said, "I want to learn to read the property documents." He put down his pen. "Why?" "Because you should have someone who understands them." She leaned against the counter. "I looked at them yesterday. The land papers, the deed, I found them in the box under the window seat." He was quiet for a moment, not angry that she'd found them. She had the run of the cabin, always had, but thinking about what she'd said. "What about them?" "The original grant document has language in it I'd want a clearer reading on, about the mineral rights on the eastern section." She crossed her arms. "And the survey markings don't match what I can see of the actual fence lines on your property map." Rowan stared at her. "The survey markings?" "I compared them to the hand-drawn map you have tacked to the supply room wall. There's a discrepancy on the northeast corner." She paused. "It might be nothing. The map could just be imprecise, but I'd rather know." He sat back in his chair and looked at this woman who had arrived on his mountain with a cracked suitcase and a quiet voice, and had apparently, somewhere in the middle of winter, read his land documents and compared them to his property maps and identified a potential survey discrepancy. "Where did you say you learned law?" he said. "I didn't say, but I read whatever I could find." She picked up the pestle again. "In Weston, there was a neighbor, an attorney named Carlyle, who let me use his books. I spent about 3 years reading them. Just because. Because I wanted to understand how things worked, how paper and law could protect a person, or fail to." She looked at him steadily. "It's useful to know." He thought about that for a moment. Then he got up and went to the supply room and came back with the deed box and set it on the table. "Show me what you found." She set down the mortar and came to the table and sat beside him. Close, for the first time, close enough that he was aware of the warmth coming off her, the smell of the herbs on her hands, and spread the documents open and showed him. She was right about the discrepancy. He didn't know what it meant yet, but she was right. They sat at that table for 2 hours, going through the documents, and he realized sometime during the second hour that he couldn't remember the last time he'd done anything with another person that required this kind of attention and felt this natural. He didn't say that. He said, "I'll write to the county clerk in the spring, get a proper survey done." "Yes," she said. "You should." She gathered up the documents and stacked them neatly and put them back in the box. And then she said goodnight and went to bed, and Rowan sat at the table for a while longer looking at the closed deed box. Careful, he told himself. But careful was getting harder to maintain. February announced itself with 3 days of clear sky and temperatures that dropped so low that the creek, which ran fast and didn't freeze easily, went silent. Rowan had seen that once before in his 12 years on the mountain, a winter cold enough to stop the creek, and it meant something specific and not comfortable about the weeks ahead. He told Evelyn. "How bad?" she said. "We have enough to last, but we need to manage it better than we have been." He looked at the supply shelf. Her shelf now, really, the one she ran. "No waste. Use everything." "All right." No hesitation. "Tell me what needs adjusting." They went through it together that evening. The stores, the firewood, the hay, the lamp oil, the things that could be stretched, and the things that couldn't. Evelyn ran the numbers faster than he did, which he'd stopped being surprised by. She had a clear mind for quantities, for ratios, for how much of something you'd use in a week and what that meant across 6 weeks. "We're all right," she said when they'd finished. "Tight, but all right. If it doesn't go long." "If it doesn't go long," she agreed. It went long. February on Frost Ridge that year was the kind of month that rewrites your understanding of what winter can mean. The cold that had settled in didn't lift. It varied, dropped lower, occasionally relented for a day or two, then returned. The snow kept coming. The days were short and pale and exhausting. The cattle needed constant watching. The firewood supply, which had seemed adequate, became something to think carefully about. Rowan worked. Evelyn worked. They fell into the natural division of labor that had been establishing itself since October and leaned into it harder. He outside with the animals and the property, she inside managing the stores and the cabin, both of them in the barn when it required 2 pairs of hands. The days had a sameness to them that was both monotonous and, in its way, steadying. It was during one of those late February evenings, after supper, that Rowan came in from a late check of the barn to find Evelyn sitting at the table with a piece of paper and a pen, and her face doing something complicated. He hung up his coat. "What is it?" She looked up. "A letter. I've been trying to write it for about 3 weeks." She looked back at the paper. "To Thomas's sister in Columbus. She wrote me before I left Weston, asking where I was going. I told her I'd write when I arrived." "And you haven't?" "No." She set down the pen. "I don't know what to say to her. She's a good woman, but she'll want to know everything. How it is here, whether I'm settled, whether I made a terrible decision." A pause. "Whether I'm happy." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. "Are you?" She looked at him. It was a direct question, and he'd asked it directly, which was not entirely his habit, and they both seemed to register that. She thought about it honestly, which he appreciated. She didn't give him the quick, easy answer. "I think I'm something," she said finally. "I'm not sure it's the same as happy. It's more like—" She searched for it. "It's like I stopped waiting for something to be wrong." She looked at the paper. "For most of my life, I was waiting for the other shoe. Whatever was good would turn. Whatever was stable would shift. I got very good at bracing." She set her hands flat on the table. "Here, I brace for weather, for hard winters, for the cattle getting sick. Real things, things I can actually do something about." She looked at him. "That's different from what I had before." Rowan was quiet for a moment. Outside, the cold night sat on the mountain. "I know what you mean," he said, "about bracing." She looked at him. "When Clara died," he said, slowly, it was still not an easy word to say, even now, but it came more naturally than it had in December. "I stopped expecting anything to last. You do that after something like that. You stop building anything that matters, because anything that matters can be taken. And you built this instead," she said, meaning the mountain, the isolation, the silence. Yeah. He looked at the fire. Something that felt too big and too hard to be taken. Did it work? He looked at her. She was watching him with those quiet eyes, no judgment in them, just the question. For a while, he said. The fire popped. Somewhere outside, wind moved through the pine trees with a low and complicated sound. You should write the letter, he said. Tell her you're settled. Tell her the mountain is harder than you expected. He looked at the paper. You don't have to explain everything. She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up the pen. He got up and put another log on the fire and went to the shelf for his own book. And they spent the rest of the evening in the kind of quiet that was no longer empty, the kind that had weight and warmth and two people in it. The letter got written. He didn't read it. But he saw her fold it carefully and set it with her things to go out on the next supply run, whenever the weather allowed, and that was enough. March came the way March comes at elevation. Not gently, not as relief, but as conflict. The season didn't change so much as fight with itself, some days warming toward something almost promising, then slamming back into hard frost, the mountain unable to make up its mind. The snowpack began to shift, not melting, not yet, but settling, compressing, changing the sound of the land. And then, on the 8th of March, the cattle got sick. Not all of them. 3, the 2 youngest and one of the older cows, developed a respiratory illness that Rowan recognized and did not like. It spread fast in close quarters. He'd lost animals to it before, in a bad year, and he knew the look of it. He told Evelyn at breakfast. She put down her fork and said, What do they need? Separation, warmth. I need to move them to the south end of the barn and keep them isolated from the others. He rubbed the back of his neck. It's going to be labor-intensive, twice daily checks. Keep them warm, monitor the others. Tell me which ones are isolated and what to watch for, she said. I can do the morning checks. You do evening. It's not easy work. She looked at him with an expression that was, if anything, slightly amused. Rowan, I've been doing not easy work since October. He couldn't argue with that. So they divided it and they managed it. And over the following 2 weeks, the rhythm of the ranch shifted to accommodate the sick animals the way a body accommodates an injury. Everything compensating, nothing stopping. Evelyn was in the barn before 6 every morning, moving through the dim lantern-lit space with practiced ease, checking temperatures, cleaning, providing water, keeping her hands and her mind on the problem. One morning, he went out earlier than usual and found her kneeling in the hay beside the oldest cow, the one they'd privately both started to worry about, talking to her in the low, even voice she used with all the animals. Her hand was moving slowly along the cow's neck. Rowan stopped in the barn doorway. She ate a little last night, Evelyn said, without looking up. She'd heard him come in. Her breathing is better than yesterday. He looked at the animal. The cow's eyes were open and following Evelyn's hand. Yeah, he said. That's better. I think she's going to be all right. Probably. He came into the barn and went to check the others, moving through the familiar work with hands that knew it. When he came back around, Evelyn was standing and brushing hay off her coat. You've gotten good at this, he said. The this meant all of it, the barn work, the reading of the animals, the whole 1,000-part vocabulary of ranch life that couldn't be taught in a class. She looked at him. I had a good teacher. He wasn't sure what to do with that, so he handed her the water bucket and said, South trough needs filling. She took it without complaint and went to fill it, and Rowan stood in the warm animal smell of the barn and felt something that was probably gratitude, or something adjacent to it, or something that had started as gratitude and become something else without permission. He was still being careful, but by March, careful was a policy he was maintaining mostly out of stubbornness rather than belief. There was a night in the 3rd week of March, the cattle recovering, the worst of winter finally, tentatively beginning to ease, when they were both in the cabin after a long and tiring day, not talking, just existing in the same space. Evelyn had fallen asleep in her chair by the fire, her book open on her lap, her head dropped slightly to one side. He'd been at the table and looked up and seen it. He sat for a while just looking. She looked tired, in the particular way of someone who has been carrying weight for months without stopping. There were shadows under her eyes. Her hands, resting on the open book, were rough from the winter work. Knuckles dry, a small scar on the back of her right hand from a wire snag she'd taken in January without making much of. She had come here with nothing but a worn suitcase and an agreement, and she had given this mountain winter everything she had, and she looked like it, and he thought that was not a diminishment but the opposite. He got up quietly and took the extra blanket from the supply room and draped it over her, careful not to wake her. She didn't stir. He went back to the table and sat down and looked at the fire for a long time. He was not good at words, had never been, had never needed to be. But sitting in that cabin with winter finally beginning to lose its grip and the woman across the room asleep in her chair, he thought he understood something he'd been working toward for months, something about what it meant to not be alone. Not just functionally, not just having another body in the house to share the labor, but actually not alone. Having someone who saw the same mountain you saw, and fought the same cold and worried the same worries, and still showed up before dawn to chip ice in the barn. He thought about Clara, not with grief, or not only grief, with the gentle ache of something that had been real and was gone. And he thought about the woman sleeping 4 feet away from him, and the way she'd said "I'm something" when he'd asked if she was happy, and how that answer was more honest than happy would have been, and how he was, he thought, something too, something more than he'd been in a long time. Outside, the mountain was still and cold. The fire burned. The lamp threw its quiet circle of light. And Rowan Blackridge sat alone with the most uncomfortable and necessary feeling he'd had in 12 years, and let it stay. The cattle recovered. All 3 of them. Even the older cow that Evelyn had been kneeling beside in the hay. The one they'd both quietly worried about in the way you worry about something you're not ready to say out loud. By the last week of March, she was eating properly and moving with her old deliberate heaviness, and Rowan opened the barn one morning to find her pressed against the south wall in a patch of weak sunlight that had found its way through a gap in the boards, eyes half closed, entirely unbothered. He stood in the doorway and felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't known was tight. He told Evelyn at breakfast. She looked up from her coffee and something moved in her face to relief. Genuine and unguarded, the kind you can't perform. All 3? All 3. She nodded and went back to her coffee and didn't make more of it than that. But her shoulders dropped about half an inch, and he saw it. April came slowly to Frost Ridge, the way it always did at elevation, not as a rival, but as argument. The snowpack began breaking up on the south-facing slopes, running off in thin, cold rivulets that cut channels in the mud. The creek unfroze section by section, its sound returning gradually, first a whisper and then, over 2 weeks, a proper voice. The days stretched. The light came back in increments that felt, after the winter they'd had, almost undeserved. Rowan started pushing the work harder, the way a man does when he can finally move again after being penned in. Fence checks, pasture work, the 100 maintenance tasks that winter put on hold and spring demanded all at once. He was up earlier, out later, moving with the particular urgency of a rancher facing a backlog. Evelyn adjusted to the change in rhythm without being asked. More meals later in the evening. Coffee kept warm for the unpredictable hour of his return. She'd started working in the yard when weather allowed, cleaning the area around the cabin, checking the drainage channels that winter debris had clogged, assessing what the snow had done to the smaller structures. They saw less of each other during those April days, which was its own kind of thing. The winter had pressed them close, the forced proximity of a small cabin during months of snow and cold. Spring opened the space back up and they moved through it, each in their separate track, and Rowan was aware of the change in the way you're aware of a sound going quiet. He missed her company more than he wanted to admit, which told him something he was still not entirely ready to look at directly. It was the 3rd week of April when he decided to inspect the northeast corner of the property. The survey discrepancy Evelyn had found back in January had been sitting in the back of his mind since then, growing slowly into something he needed to resolve. He'd written to the county clerk in February, but the reply had been slow and vague. The clerk's office was backlogged. Someone would be out in the spring, no specific date. And in the meantime, the only honest thing to do was see the corner himself. He told Evelyn at breakfast, "I'm going out to the northeast corner today. Might be long. The trail up that side is rough after winter." She looked up. He could see her doing the quick private calculation she always did. How far, how long, what the weather looked like. "The sky's been clear," she said, But there were clouds building on the north ridge yesterday afternoon. I know. I'll watch them. He pushed back from the table. I'll be back before dark. She nodded. Then, take the extra rope, the one in the south corner of the barn. He stopped. Why? The northeast trail goes along that rock shelf above the creek bend. It was icy in November. Spring melt makes rock like that unpredictable. She held his gaze steadily. Just take the rope. He looked at her for a moment. There was no point arguing with logic, and it was logic, and they both knew it. All right, he said. He took the rope. The trail to the northeast corner was everything she'd anticipated, and worse. Spring melt had done real damage to the path. Sections had slid away entirely, replaced by loose rubble and mud that took Buck carefully and slowly. The rock shelf above the creek bend was wet and treacherous, streaked with mineral runoff from the snowmelt above, and Rowan navigated it with his full attention, which meant the 2 hours out felt like 4. He found the corner marker, an iron stake driven into the rock face that marked the boundary of his property. He pulled out the deed's survey description and compared it to what he was seeing. Evelyn had been right. The discrepancy was real. The survey description placed his northeast boundary approximately 40 feet further east than the stake suggested. 40 feet of rock and slope that, on paper, belonged to Frost Ridge and, in iron, did not. He stood on that cold, wet shelf of rock above his creek and looked east at the 40 feet of mountain that somebody had decided, somewhere and at some point, to quietly exclude from his deed, and felt a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature move through him. He took careful notes, measurements, landmarks, the specific wording from the deed. He worked for longer than he meant to, absorbed in the details, and it was the sound of the creek changing below him that finally made him look up. The water had risen, not dramatically, but it was higher and faster than it had been 2 hours ago, and when he looked north, he understood why. The clouds Evelyn had mentioned on the north ridge had built into something substantial while he was focused on the survey markers, a dark shelf of weather moving south faster than he'd expected. He put the papers away and started back. He was on the rock shelf, the same stretch of wet rock he'd crossed carefully on the way out, when the ground moved. It wasn't dramatic, not the way a rock slide looks when you imagine one. It was more like the mountain simply changing its mind. A section of the shelf above him, saturated by days of melt and undermined by the water running beneath it, gave way with a sound that was less a crash than a deep, grinding exhalation. A cascade of rock and rubble, none of it enormous, all of it sudden, came down the slope and caught him on the left side. Buck screamed and bolted. Rowan went down. He didn't lose consciousness. That was the first thing he established when the noise stopped. He was still aware, still thinking. He was on his back against the slope. His left arm had taken a hit and was making its displeasure known in terms that were difficult to ignore. His right leg was pinned under a section of rock that he couldn't immediately assess because moving to look at it produced a flash of pain so specific and total that he stopped moving immediately. He lay still for a moment and breathed. The creek was loud below him. The clouds had moved overhead. It was beginning to spit cold rain. His leg was pinned, and it was bad, and he was alone on a wet rock shelf 6 miles from the cabin. He took stock the way a man takes stock when there is no option but clarity. What he had, what he didn't have, what was possible. He had his coat. He had the rope, Evelyn's rope, coiled and still attached to his belt where he'd hooked it before crossing the shelf. He had his knife. He did not have Buck, who had gone and was not coming back. What he didn't have was time to waste on anything that wasn't getting himself free and moving. The rock on his leg was part of a larger section, but most of its weight was distributed awkwardly, more lateral pressure than direct. He tested it carefully, found the point of maximum resistance, and went to work. It took 40 minutes. The rain came harder. He used the rope as leverage at one point, braced against a stable section of rock above him, and the rock shifted enough finally for him to drag his leg free. He looked at it. His boot was intact. That was something. Whether the leg itself was intact was harder to say. It bore his weight when he tested it, barely, and with a quality of pain that told him something was wrong in there, something bent or cracked, but not, mercifully, snapped clean through. He could walk, slowly, not well. He started toward the cabin. It was 4 miles of rough mountain trail with a damaged leg and a left arm that had stopped bleeding but continued to complain in rain that came down steady and cold. He counted his steps at some points, which is what the mind does when it needs something simple to hold on to. He stopped twice. Once to rest against a tree, once to tighten something on his boot that had come loose. He did not stop a third time because he was not sure he'd get up again. He thought about Evelyn. Not deliberately. He didn't decide to think about her. She was just there. Her face, her voice, the particular way she'd said just take the rope that morning. He thought about the fire she'd have going. He thought about the cabin, the specific warmth of it, the smell of wood smoke and whatever she'd put on the stove. He walked. The light was going gray by the time the trail came off the upper slope, and he could see the smoke rising from the cabin chimney through the rain. He stopped for a moment and looked at it, and felt something in him that was close to relief but had its own particular quality. Not just, I'm going to be all right, but something more specific, more human. He kept moving. He came around the last bend, and Evelyn was on the porch. She'd heard him, or heard something, and come to the door, and she was standing at the top of the porch steps looking down the trail, and she saw him and went very still for exactly 1 second. And then she was down the steps and coming toward him through the mud and rain with the kind of focused speed that had no room in it for anything except the problem. How bad? She said, getting under his left arm before he'd said a word. Leg, rock slide on the northeast shelf. Weight on it? I've been walking on it for, he didn't actually know how long. A while. All right. She had his arm across her shoulders and was already moving them toward the cabin. She was not a large woman, and he was not a small man, but she moved with leverage and purpose and didn't stagger. Left arm? Hit something. It stopped bleeding. I'll look at it inside. They got up the porch steps. He took them badly, missing the second one, and she held the weight without comment. And through the door, and she got him to the chair by the fire with the methodical efficiency of someone who had been thinking about this or something like this for longer than the past 5 minutes. Sit. Don't take the boot off yet. She went and came back with scissors, and the lamp turned high and knelt on the floor in front of him, and the way she looked at his leg was the way she'd looked at the deed papers back in January, focused, analytical, reading what was in front of her for what it actually said rather than what she hoped it said. I need to cut the trouser leg, she said. Go ahead. She cut it cleanly, looked at what was underneath. Her expression didn't change, which he was grateful for because what she was looking at was not good. The leg was swollen already, dark along the outer side, the kind of bruising that came from inside. Can you feel this? She pressed carefully in 2 places. Yes. Yes. Move your foot. He moved it. She sat back on her heels. I don't think it's broken through the bone, but I think something's cracked. She looked up at him. I can't be certain without a doctor. There's no getting a doctor up here tonight. I know. She stood. Then we do what we can. She paused for just a moment, and in that pause he saw it. The thing she was managing, the fear underneath the competence, the way her jaw was set not from calm, but from the effort of holding calm together. I need you to be straight with me about the pain. I'll be straight with you. Good. She moved to the shelf where she kept her medicines, the small collection she'd assembled over the winter from what the cabin had and what she'd ordered in fall. Things he'd never thought to organize. I'm going to splint it and bind it. It's going to hurt. I figured. She worked. She did it correctly. He would know, more or less, from years of ranch work and the injuries that came with it. And she did it correctly, firm and precise, asking him every few minutes where the pain was and adjusting accordingly. When she bound the left arm, a deep gash along the forearm that had done more damage than he'd registered in the cold and the focus of walking home, she cleaned it thoroughly and didn't wince at what she found. He watched her face while she worked. She was not okay. She was functioning at a level above okay, which was different and cost more. You can slow down, he said. She looked up. I'm fine. I know you're fine. You can still slow down. She held his gaze for a moment. Something in her face shifted, just slightly, the controlled surface giving a fraction. Then she looked back at the arm and continued, but at a slightly different pace. And he thought that was something. When she finished, she sat back and looked at him. Both of them were breathing in the quiet of the aftermath. "You have to stay off that leg," she said. "I know. I mean it, not like the shoulder." Her voice had an edge to it that wasn't anger but was the close neighbor of anger. "This is different. Evelyn, you walked 4 miles on a cracked bone," she said, "in the rain, alone." The edge in her voice had sharpened into something real, something direct. "I had the rope ready because I was afraid something would happen on that shelf. I knew it was dangerous. You knew it was dangerous." She stopped, pressed her lips together. "It was still the right call to go. I'm not saying it wasn't, but I was—" She stopped again. "Scared," he said. She looked at him. "Yes." The word came out rough at the edges. "Scared. I sat here for 3 hours watching that trail, and you know what I kept thinking?" He waited. "I kept thinking what I would do," she said, "if you didn't come back. If Buck came home alone." She looked at her hands. "I had the whole thing worked out. What I'd take, what route I'd try to the Crawford place over the South Ridge, whether the snow was hard enough to walk on, or whether I'd sink." She looked up. "I had a plan because having a plan is what I do when I'm afraid and can't do anything else." The fire crackled. Rain ran in thin lines down the window glass. "I came back," he said. "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "I know you did." He looked at her, at the careful, controlled, competent face of this woman who had come to his mountain with nothing and built herself into the architecture of his days so thoroughly that he could not now imagine the place without her, who sat on his floor and made plans for a version of events she didn't let herself believe in because she was afraid of losing something she hadn't let herself admit she had. "Evelyn," he said. She looked at him. "I came back," he said again, and this time there was something else in it. She was still for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, the small, tight nod he knew, and stood up and went to the stove. That was all. That was enough. He was confined again. Worse than the shoulder, because the leg required absolute rest in a way that his shoulder hadn't, and because spring was not winter and the world outside was demanding things that couldn't wait. Evelyn did them. She ran the ranch. That was the plain fact of the following weeks, and Rowan watched it from his chair and his cot and the narrow circuit between them with a complicated mixture of frustration and something else, something warmer that he had stopped pretending wasn't there. She was not perfect at it. She made mistakes. She tried to move a fence post she wasn't quite strong enough to move alone, and it fell on her foot and she came inside with a limp. She didn't mention until he noticed it 3 days later and was furious, and they had the first real argument in months over her not telling him. "I didn't want you to worry," she said. "That is exactly backwards," he said. "I need to know what's happening out there. I need—" He stopped, recalibrated. "I need you to tell me when you're hurt." She looked at him with those eyes. "Because you worry." Yes. Something softened in her expression. It was a specific softening, the particular quality of learning something you hadn't been sure of. "All right," she said. "I'll tell you." He told her things too, everything he could tell her from his chair, where the weak spots were in the east pasture, how to read the older cattle's behavior for early illness, which posts were sound and which needed watching. He talked more in those weeks than he talked in the previous 12 years combined, and she listened to all of it, asked precise questions, went out and applied what he'd said, came back and reported. She sent a letter to the county clerk herself, not asking, informing them that a survey assessment of the northeast corner of the Black Ridge property was overdue and that she expected to hear from them within 30 days with a scheduled date. She showed it to Rowan before she sent it. He read it, looked at her. "That's a direct tone." "I've been told I can be direct," she said. "Who told you that?" "A judge in Weston, during the settlement of Thomas's estate." She folded the letter. "He meant it as a criticism. I took it as a compliment." Rowan handed the letter back. "Send it." She sent it. The reply came faster than the first one. What she could not fix was the leg, which mended on its own schedule and no other. It was 4 weeks before he could walk on it without the brace, another 2 before he could ride, and the whole period was a lesson in patience that Rowan failed repeatedly. He was difficult. He knew he was difficult. He had no gift for stillness and no particular talent for accepting help, and both of those things were being required of him simultaneously. Evelyn managed him the way she managed the mountain, with consistency, with patience, and without illusions about what she was dealing with. "You're impossible," she told him, on a day when he'd tried to get up and do fence work, and she'd physically blocked the doorway. "I'm going stir crazy," he said. "I know. Sit back down. Evelyn, if you open that leg back up, we add another 4 weeks. Sit down." He sat down. He did not do so gracefully. She turned from the doorway and went to the shelf and took down the book she'd been reading aloud to him during the evenings. "Chapter 14, she said, pulling up a chair. "I don't want chapter 14. "You want to suffer through the afternoon in silence instead?" He was quiet. She opened the book. He listened. On an evening in late May, with his leg healing properly and the mountain finally warming toward something that could be called spring. Without irony, they were sitting on the porch after supper, the first time they'd sat outside in months. The air was cool but not cold, carrying the smell of pine and wet earth, and the particular green smell of things beginning again. The sun was going down behind the western ridge, pulling long shadows across the pasture. Rowan was looking at his land, at the fence lines, the creek glinting in the last light, the cattle moving slow and dark against the pale grass. He was thinking about the survey discrepancy, about the letter Evelyn had sent, about the things he'd half understood about the northeast boundary and hadn't fully sorted through yet. "Something's coming," he said. Evelyn looked at him. "What kind of something?" "The survey discrepancy. It's not a mistake." He'd been turning it over for weeks, and the shape of it had become clear as it sat in his mind. "Someone moved that marker. Survey markers don't drift 40 feet. She was quiet for a moment. "No, they don't. Which means someone put it there intentionally, which means someone has an interest in where my northeast boundary sits." He looked at her. "Who has an interest?" She looked out at the pasture for a long time. "The railroad." He waited. "There's been talk in Caldwell Creek since last fall," she said. "I heard it when I arrived at the depot. The men were talking about a rail line being planned through the mountains. Eastern approach." She turned to him. "Through the northeast corridor." Rowan felt the cold move through him again. The same cold as standing on the wet rock shelf looking at that marker. The cold that had nothing to do with temperature. "Through my northeast corner," he said. "Possibly." She met his eyes. "If your boundary is where the deed says it is." "But not if it's where the stake says it is." She said nothing. She didn't need to. He looked out at his land. The sun was nearly gone now, the last light going pink and thin across the snow, still sitting on the high peaks. The creek moved with its new spring voice, unhurried. The cattle had settled. The mountain was what it always was. Enormous, indifferent, older than memory. He had built his life on this rock. He had come here with a dead woman's name in his chest and a deed in his pocket and 12 years of silence, and it had become the only place in the world he knew how to be. And now something was moving against it, something with money and influence, and the patience to set the groundwork slowly, and he was sitting on his porch with a leg still healing and a woman beside him who had been cataloging the documents and watching the horizon since January. "What do we do?" he said. "Not what do I do." He'd stopped saying that weeks ago without noticing. Evelyn looked at the deed box she'd brought out to the porch earlier, sitting between their chairs. She'd had it out several times this week. "First, we document everything," she said. "Every measurement, every marker, every discrepancy. We build a record that can stand in front of a judge." She paused. "Then we wait to see who comes." Her voice was steady. Her hands, resting on the arms of the chair, were still. Rowan looked at her. This woman who had arrived with nothing but a cracked suitcase and a calm he'd mistaken for passivity, and who was in fact the most quietly formidable person he'd ever met. Who had kept his cattle alive and run his land and fixed his leg and sent direct letters to county clerks and read his deed documents in January as a precaution. "Evelyn," he said. She looked at him. "I'm glad you came," he said. It was not, for Rowan Blackridge, a small thing to say. She seemed to understand that. She was quiet for a moment, and when she looked at him, her face was open in a way that it had taken months to become, no longer carefully managed, no longer performing calm. Just her. "I know," she said. "I'm glad I came too." The last light left for the mountain. The stars were beginning, one by one, to assert themselves against the darkening sky. Below the porch, the creek ran clean and cold with snowmelt, and somewhere in the timber an owl started up its questioning, and Frost Ridge sat in the mountain dark, solid and scarred and entirely itself. Neither of them moved for a long time. They came on a Tuesday morning in early June, which was, Rowan would think later, a deliberately chosen day. Not a Monday, when a man might still be fresh from the weekend and his wits about him. Not a Friday, when town would be busy with people moving through. A Tuesday, quiet, unremarkable. A working day in the middle of a working week, when a mountain rancher would be out on his property and a woman would be alone in the cabin, and the whole enterprise would look easy. They miscalculated on that last part. Rowan was in the south pasture checking a section of fence when he heard the horses. Not Buck, he knew Buck's gait the way you know a voice, but multiple horses moving up the trail at a pace that wasn't casual. He came over the ridge on foot, his legs still not fully right but functional, and saw them from the high ground before they saw him. 4 riders. One of them in a coat that cost more than most men in Caldwell Creek made in a month. Behind them, a wagon with 2 more men sitting on the bench, and in the wagon bed something that looked like survey equipment. They were headed for the cabin. He came down off the ridge faster than his leg appreciated. He got to the cabin yard about 3 minutes after they did, which was 3 minutes he would spend the rest of his life wishing he'd had. Because by the time he came around the corner of the barn, the man in the expensive coat was already on the porch, and Evelyn was already at the door, and the conversation had already started without him. The man was somewhere in his 50s, heavy across the shoulders, silver-haired, the kind of face that had been handsome once and now wore authority the way some men wear it, like a coat they never take off. He was holding a sheaf of papers, and he was speaking with the comfortable tone of someone who expects to be listened to. Entirely routine, Mrs. Blackridge. The survey is a formality at this stage, since the documentation is already in order. We simply need access to the northeast section to mark the boundary correctly, and then we can— "The boundary is already marked," Evelyn said. Her voice was even. Rowan came into the yard and the riders noticed him, but Evelyn's eyes flicked to him only for a moment. A quick acknowledgement, "I see you," before going back to the man on her porch. "Mr. Blackridge?" The man turned and extended his hand with the practiced ease of someone who had extended hands as a professional occupation. "Victor Langford, Pacific Mountain Railroad. I was just explaining to your wife." "I heard," Rowan said. He did not take the hand. "What documentation?" Langford's expression shifted slightly. "Not much. The adjustment of a man recalibrating." He turned back and offered the papers to Evelyn, who was closer. "A property transfer document, executed in 1887 by the original grant holder, a Mr. Duncan Ferris, conveying the northeast parcel, approximately 200 acres, to the territorial government in exchange for relief of delinquent taxes. The territory subsequently transferred the parcel to the Rail Authority under the Development Act of 1889. He said it the way lawyers and men who employed lawyers said things, smoothly, with the implication that the smoothness itself was a form of proof. Evelyn took the papers. Rowan came up the porch steps and stood beside her, and they looked at the documents together. He felt her stillness beside him, the specific quality of it, the focused kind, the kind that meant she was reading fast and hard. "Duncan Ferris," Rowan said. "I bought this property from a man named Gerald Harwick in 1879. Mr. Harwick acquired it from Ferris in 1876, Langford said. However, the tax delinquency predates that sale. The transfer to the territory occurred in 1874, prior to Harwick's acquisition, which means Harwick could not legally have conveyed the northeast parcel, as he did not own it at the time of his purchase." He paused. "Which means, with respect, neither do you." Rowan looked at the papers. He was not a lawyer and didn't pretend to be, and the language was thick with the specific density of legal documents designed to be difficult to argue with in the moment. "We'll need time to review these," Evelyn said. "Of course." Langford's tone was generous in the way that men are generous when they believe they've already won. "I'll give you until end of week. We'd like to begin survey operations Monday morning." "You'll give us 30 days, Evelyn said. Langford looked at her, a small recalibration. "Mrs. Blackridge, the documents you've presented reference the Development Act of 1889, she said, still looking at the papers. That act includes a mandatory 60-day notice period for disputed land claims. You've given us 4 days' notice. That's not compliant, Mr. Langford. She looked up at him. 30 days is me being reasonable. A silence. One of the riders shifted in his saddle. The man on the wagon bench exchanged a look with the other. Langford studied Evelyn with an expression that was harder to read than the one he'd arrived with. You're familiar with the Development Act. I'm familiar with property law generally, she said, and I'm familiar with this property specifically. She handed the documents back to him. 30 days. If your documentation is as clean as you're suggesting, 30 days won't change anything. Langford took the papers. He looked at Rowan. You should know that the railroad has significant interest in this corridor. This will move forward one way or another. It might, Rowan said, but it'll move forward correctly. Langford held his gaze for a moment. Then he put the papers inside his coat, nodded once with the courtesy of a man saving his real response for later, and turned and walked down the porch steps to his horse. They watched the party ride back down the trail until the sound of hooves faded into the mountain quiet. Then Evelyn sat down on the porch step. Rowan sat beside her. His leg was throbbing from the run down off the ridge, which he wasn't going to mention. He's lying, Evelyn said, about the documents. You're sure? Not entirely, not yet. She was looking at the trail where Langford had gone. But the 1874 tax transfers, if that was real and that clean, the Harwick sale would never have cleared. Someone would have caught it. That kind of encumbrance shows in a title search. She paused. Unless the title search was managed by someone who had a reason not to catch it. Rowan was quiet for a moment. How do we prove it? She turned and looked at him with those eyes that had been reading people and situations and documents for 35 years. We go to Caldwell Creek, she said. We find the original county records, the 1874 tax rolls, the transfer documentation, the Harwick deed. She stood up. If those documents were fabricated, there will be inconsistencies, paper from different eras, seals that don't match, language that didn't exist in 1874. She brushed off her skirt. Forged documents always have seams. When? Tomorrow, she said. First light. They left at dawn. The ride into Caldwell Creek took 2 hours on a good day, and the road was muddy from spring rain, so it took closer to 3. They didn't talk much on the way down. Rowan drove and Evelyn sat beside him with the deed box on her lap and the focused inward expression of someone running through contingencies. Caldwell Creek was a town of 400 people in a good year, which meant it had a courthouse, a land office, a general store, 2 saloons, a doctor's practice, a telegraph office, and the particular social ecosystem of a small mountain community where everyone knew the broad outlines of everyone else's business. They'd been there together twice in the winter. Supply runs, both of them, brief and practical. Rowan knew a handful of people. Evelyn knew fewer. The county recorder's office was in the back of the courthouse, staffed by a man named Abe Tillman, who was somewhere north of 60, meticulous to the point of personal religion about his files, and deeply suspicious of anyone asking to look at original documents. Evelyn handled him. Rowan watched her do it and tried not to look surprised. She was different in town than she was on the mountain. Not false, just adjusted, the way a person adjusts the volume of their voice in different rooms. She was warmer, more deliberate. She asked about Tillman's filing system with a specific interest that was genuine enough to be convincing, and within 20 minutes she had the man pulling records from his shelves with something approaching enthusiasm. The 1874 tax records, she said, spreading them on the reading table, and the original Ferris Grant document, and anything from the Territory Recorder's Office from 1873 to 1876. Tillman set them out. He stayed in the room, which was his right. Evelyn didn't acknowledge his presence beyond a brief thank you, and then she bent over the documents and went to work. Rowan sat across from her and watched the door and handed her things when she asked. She worked for 2 hours, quietly, methodically, with the absolute focus of someone who knew what they were looking for and understood that finding it required patience over urgency. She made notes in her small, precise handwriting. She compared documents side by side. She used a magnifying lens she'd brought from the cabin, he hadn't known she had it, to examine stamps and seals. At the 90-minute mark, she set down the lens and sat back and looked at her notes. There it is, she said. Her voice was quiet. Tillman looked up from his desk in the corner. The 1874 tax transfer document, she said, turning her notes so Rowan could see. The territorial seal on this document uses a stamp design that wasn't adopted until 1881. The document is dated 1874. She looked at him. Someone used a stamp that didn't exist yet. Rowan stared at the document. That's a forgery. She said it cleanly. A good one. Whoever made it knew enough to get most of the details right, but they got the seal wrong. She looked at Tillman. Mr. Tillman, when did the Territorial Recorder's Office adopt the double ring seal design? Tillman blinked. He was a careful man, and she'd just handed him a puzzle that his particular temperament found irresistible. He came to the table, looked at what she was pointing to, and went to his shelves without being asked. He came back with a thin registry book and flipped through it with practiced hands. 1881, he said. March. The single ring design was used up until then. He looked at the document on the table. His face did something complicated. This document has the double ring. Dated 1874, Evelyn said. Tillman looked at the document for a long time. That's not right, he said quietly. That's not right at all. No, Evelyn said. It isn't. She asked Tillman to hold the original documents and make no copies available to any third parties pending a legal review. He agreed with the stiffness of a man whose professional integrity had just been personally offended. She thanked him and gathered her notes, and they walked out into the June morning. Outside on the courthouse steps, Rowan stood next to her and looked at the street. His jaw was tight. Langford had this made, he said, or had someone make it. He wouldn't have done it himself. She tucked her notes into the deed box. He planned this carefully, probably has had surveyors up in that corridor for months. This wasn't improvised. He thought we wouldn't look. He thought you wouldn't look, she said. He thought he was dealing with a mountain rancher who'd see official-looking documents and lawyers and back down. She paused. He didn't account for me. Rowan looked at her. She was looking at the street, at the ordinary business of a Tuesday morning in a small mountain town, and her face was set with a quality he recognized, the same quality it had when she'd blocked the cabin doorway with her body to keep him from walking on a cracked leg. Not aggressive, just immovable. What now? He said. We need a lawyer, she said. A good one. And we need to file a challenge with the district court before Langford does anything else. She looked at him. And we need to talk to people. What people? People who've dealt with Langford before. People who might know what else he's done. She turned to face him directly. He didn't get where he is by doing this once. There will be others. They spent the rest of the day in Caldwell Creek. Evelyn went to the lawyer, a man named Garrett Pierce, who ran a small practice above the hardware store and had a reputation for being difficult in court, which was what she was looking for. Rowan went to the saloon, not to drink, but to talk, the way men in small towns have always used saloons as information exchanges. He was not naturally a talking man, but he was a known man, and that counted for something. He sat and he listened and he asked careful questions, and within an hour he had 3 names. Ranchers on the eastern approach who had sold under pressure in the last 2 years, who had taken Langford's money or Langford's terms because they'd believed there was no alternative. One of them, a man named Cal Hutchins, who ran cattle in the valley below Frost Ridge's northeast corner, was at the bar when Rowan found it. Hutchins was a few years older than Rowan, weathered, with the look of a man who had been angry about something for a while, and had gotten tired of it. He listened to what Rowan said. He was quiet for a long moment. He showed you a tax transfer document? Hutchins said. 1874. Fake seal. Hutchins set down his glass. He showed me a right-of-way agreement, said my grandfather signed it. My grandfather died in 1871. He looked at the bar surface. I didn't know enough to fight it. He stopped. I took what he offered because it seemed like all there was. It wasn't all there was, Rowan said. We can prove the documents are forged. Hutchins looked at him. Can you? Yes. And if you go to court with this, we'll need you to testify about the right-of-way agreement, about what he showed you. A long silence. Rowan didn't push it. Hutchins was a man weighing something, and men doing that needed to be left to do it. Who's we? Hutchins said. Me, Rowan said. My wife, and anyone else Langford has done this to. Hutchins looked at him for another moment. Then he picked up his glass, drank the last of it, and set it down. "My boy lost half a year's grazing land in that sale," he said. "He's 22 and starting out, and he lost it before he even understood what was happening." He turned on his stool. "Tell me when and where." The court date was set for the 3rd week of June. Garrett Pierce was, as advertised, difficult. Difficult to understand sometimes, because he spoke in the dense shorthand of a man who had been in law for 30 years and had stopped translating for civilians. But he understood what they had, and he understood what it meant. And when Evelyn laid out the seal discrepancy and the corroborating records and the names of the other affected landowners, he looked at her with an expression that was closest to respect. "You did this yourself," he said. "The document analysis. I had access to the county records. You knew what to look for." "I knew forgeries have seams," she said. "I looked for the seams." Pierce looked at the notes for a long time. "Mrs. Blackridge," he said, "in 30 years of practice, I have had clients arrive with less preparation than this." A pause. "I'll need all of it in written form." "It's already in written form," she said, and put a second set of notes on his desk. The preparation for the hearing occupied the 2 weeks between. Evelyn worked on the documentation. Pierce worked on the legal argument. Rowan worked on the ranch during the days and sat with Evelyn in the evenings going through the case the way they'd gone through the property documents in January. Side by side at the table, lamp turned high, talking through the weak points and the strong ones. Langford was not idle. 3 days before the hearing, 2 of his men rode up to the northeast corner of Frost Ridge and began placing survey stakes on the disputed parcel as if the matter were already resolved. Rowan rode out and told them to leave. They did not leave. He did not touch them. He understood that touching them was what they wanted, what Langford wanted, a provocation to cloud the hearing with a counter-complaint. He rode back to the cabin. "He put stakes on the northeast corner," he said. Evelyn looked up from the table. Her jaw set. "How many men?" "2." She looked at the notes in front of her. Then she picked up her pen and wrote Pierce a letter describing what had happened and mailed it that same afternoon. Pierce's response arrived the next day. "Noted. Document it. Do nothing else. Let them keep putting up stakes." "He wants them to put up stakes," Evelyn said, reading the letter. "Why?" She looked up, a small, tight, entirely humorless smile. "Because every stake they put up before the court rules is an act of trespass against property that still legally belongs to you." She set down the letter. "He's letting Langford build a contempt case for us." Rowan looked at her for a moment. "I'm glad you know things I don't." She looked at him. The smile changed, still small, but warmer. "I'm glad you let me use them." The hearing was held in the Caldwell Creek Courthouse on a Thursday morning, and most of the town came, which was what happened in small towns when something real was at stake. The courtroom was not large, and by 9 o'clock it was standing room, ranchers and merchants and townspeople filling the benches and the back wall, because word had gotten out about what was being argued and what it meant, not just for Frost Ridge, but for every piece of mountain land that a railroad with money and lawyers had been quietly measuring. Judge Elias Croft was a tall man, spare, with the kind of face that gave nothing away. He ran his courtroom with a minimum of ceremony and a maximum of precision. And when Langford's lawyer, a city man, polished from the railroad's Denver office, began his presentation with the confidence of someone accustomed to winning in venues like this, Croft listened with complete neutrality. Langford himself was present. He sat at his table in the expensive coat and watched the proceedings with the composed expression of a man who had done this before and expected to do it again. When Rowan and Evelyn came in and took their seats across the aisle, he glanced at them once and looked away. He didn't look at Evelyn specifically. That was a mistake. Pierce presented their case with the organized efficiency of a man who had 30 years of courtroom economy behind him. The forgery evidence first, the seal discrepancy, laid out with documentary proof from Tillman's records, and Tillman himself on the stand, precise and offended, confirming the dates and the design transition with the authority of a man whose professional life was those records. Then the corroborating landowners, Hutchins and 2 others, each describing documents Langford's agents had shown them, each description revealing the same pattern of fabricated historical claims. Then Evelyn. Pierce called her as a witness, and she took the stand with the same qualities she'd had on the porch when Langford arrived. Calm, measured, entirely present. She answered Pierce's questions in the clear, direct language she'd always used, walking the court through the document analysis step by step, explaining what she'd found and how and what it meant. Langford's lawyer cross-examined her with the particular condescension of a man who had decided she was the weakest point. "Mrs. Blackridge," he said, with a tone that put Mrs. in a box it didn't belong in. "You're not a lawyer." "No," she said. "You have no formal legal training." "Not formal, no." "Then on what basis do you present yourself as qualified to analyze legal documents?" She looked at him with the steadiness of someone who had been underestimated for a long time and had learned exactly what to do with it. "On the basis that I read the documents carefully and compared them to verified records in the county archive," she said. "Anyone who can read could have found what I found. The difference is that I looked." A murmur in the courtroom. Langford's lawyer pressed harder, which was the wrong instinct. He asked her to walk through her analysis again, apparently believing the repetition would expose a weakness. It didn't. Each repetition was identical to the last because she was describing what she'd actually done and what she'd actually found, and those things don't change on retelling. At some point during the second repetition, Judge Croft raised a hand to stop the questioning. He looked at the documents on the bench before him. He looked at Tillman's testimony and his notes. He looked at Evelyn on the stand. Then he looked at Langford. "Mr. Langford," Croft said, "your counsel has had ample opportunity to challenge the documentary evidence presented. I've heard nothing that addresses the central finding, that a seal design not in use until 1881 appears on a document dated 1874. Do you have an explanation for that?" Langford's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, the seal design question is—" "I asked Mr. Langford," Croft said. The courtroom was quiet. Langford sat very still. His composed expression had changed. Not broken, not collapsed, but shifted, the way a building shifts before it comes down. He said nothing. Croft looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked back at the documents. The recess lasted 40 minutes. When Croft returned to the bench, his face carried the specific expression of a judge who has arrived at a conclusion he finds personally distasteful and professionally straightforward. He looked at the full courtroom without surprise. He'd known they were there. "The documentary evidence presented by the Blackridge party," he said, in the unhurried voice of someone who had written this decision before coming back into the room, "establishes with sufficient clarity that the 1874 tax transfer document submitted by the Railroad Authority contains anachronistic elements inconsistent with its stated date. The territorial seal appearing on the document cannot have been applied prior to 1881. This court finds the document fraudulent." He paused. "The northeast parcel described in the original Blackridge deed remains the lawful property of Rowan Blackridge. The railroad's claim to said parcel is rejected. Any survey markers placed on said parcel prior to this ruling are to be removed within 5 days at the railroad's expense." He looked directly at Langford. The court further notes that the pattern of documentation described by multiple landowners in these proceedings suggests a systematic practice that this court considers deeply concerning. I'm referring this matter to the Territorial Attorney General's office for further review." He closed the folder in front of him. Court is adjourned. The room came up off its benches. Rowan sat very still for a moment in the noise around him. People standing, talking, Hutchins somewhere behind him making a sound that might have been a laugh, Pierce gathering his papers with the brisk satisfaction of a man who had expected this outcome and was pleased to have been right. Langford's lawyer was already leaning in to speak quietly and urgently to his client, and Langford was listening with the face of a man recalculating. Evelyn was still sitting beside him. He turned and looked at her. She was looking at the judge's empty bench. Her hands were in her lap still. She looked not triumphant, not relieved exactly. Something quieter than both of those. Something that had the quality of a breath finally let out after being held too long. "You did that," he said. She turned and looked at him. "We did it." "Evelyn," he held her gaze. "I was sitting at the table. You built the case." She looked at him for a long moment. Around them, the courtroom noise continued, people moving, voices overlapping. She said, "I've been waiting my whole life to be useful in a room where it mattered." He didn't have a response that was equal to that. He wasn't sure one existed. He reached across and put his hand over hers on the bench between them. She looked at his hand. Then she turned her palm up and held it, and neither of them said anything else. Outside the courthouse, the street was June warm and bright. Hutchins came and shook their hands. Rowan's first, then Evelyn's, which he held for a moment and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Blackridge. My boy thanks you too." She nodded and said she was glad they'd talked. Pierce came out with his papers under his arm and told them he'd be in touch about the Attorney General referral, and that they should expect Langford to be quiet for a while. "He'll look for another angle eventually," Pierce said. "Men like that always do." "Let him find it," Evelyn said. "We'll be ready." Pierce looked at her, then at Rowan, and the corner of his mouth moved in something close to a smile. "I imagine you will," he said, and walked on. They drove home in the late afternoon light, the wagon moving up the mountain trail with the horses settling into the familiar climb. The valley fell away below them. The air cooled and sharpened as they rose. The mountain took them back in the way mountains take things back, indifferently, completely, as if the town and the courtroom and the man in the expensive coat were all equally small from up here. Rowan drove. Evelyn sat beside him with the deed box on her lap. After a while she said, "He'll appeal. Probably. We'll win again." He looked at her. "How do you know?" She looked out at the mountain. "Because we're right," she said, "and because next time I'll know exactly where he's going to look for the seam." He drove. The trail climbed. "Evelyn," he said. When we get back." He kept his eyes on the road. "I want to talk." A pause. "About what?" "About—" He stopped, started again. "About what this is. What we are." He felt clumsy with it, which was honest. "I'm not good at this kind of thing." "I know," she said. "I've noticed. But I want to say it. Whatever it is. I want it said." She was quiet for a moment. The horses moved. The trail wound upward through the timber, the late light falling in long bars through the pines. "All right," she said softly. "When we get back." Frost Ridge came into view around the last bend, the cabin solid on its shelf of mountain, smoke beginning from the chimney where the banked fire had taken the evening cool as its cue. The creek ran bright below the pasture. The cattle were settled in the last light. It looked, Rowan thought, like something worth fighting for. It looked like home. They got back to the cabin as the last light was leaving the sky. Rowan unhitched the horses and put them up and took longer about it than usual, moving through the familiar motions of the barn in the near dark, with the particular slowness of a man postponing something he'd committed to. He knew it. The horses probably knew it. He brushed Buck anyway, longer than needed, and Buck stood patient and uncomplaining, which was more than Rowan deserved. When he came inside, Evelyn had the fire going and supper on the stove, and the lamp turned to its evening height, and the cabin looked exactly like it had looked every evening for 8 months, which was to say, it looked like the most specific place in the world. Not beautiful. It was still a working mountain cabin with rough walls and a plank floor, and a calendar 2 years out of date that he'd still never taken down. But it had weight to it now, presence. The presence of two people who had put their hands to it, and their time into it, and their worry through it. She looked up when he came in. "Supper's about 20 minutes, she said. He hung his coat. He took off his hat. He stood in the middle of the room for a moment, and she watched him with that steady gaze of hers. And he understood that she knew he was about to say the thing he'd said he would say, and she was waiting for him to figure out how. He pulled out a chair and sat down at the table. "Sit with me." She turned the stove down and came and sat across from him. The fire went about its business. Outside, the mountain settled into its June night sounds. The creek, the timber, an owl starting up somewhere on the eastern slope. He looked at her. She looked at him. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "I know. I mean that genuinely. I've been alone a long time, and I got used to not saying things." He put his hands flat on the table. "But I think not saying things has cost me enough that I should try." She didn't say anything. She was letting him find it, which was what she did. Left doors open without standing in the frame. "When I went out to the northeast corner in April," he said, "and I was on that trail coming home with the leg in the rain, I kept thinking about the cabin, about the fire, about—" He stopped. "About you. Not in a general way, specifically. The way you'd handed me that rope in the morning. The way you were going to have something hot ready when I got back." He looked at his hands. It wasn't about having someone there. It was about you being the one there. Evelyn was still. And in the courtroom today, he said, watching you on that stand, watching you take everything Langford tried to build and just take it apart, piece by piece, with nothing but a magnifying lens and the fact that you looked when nobody else did. He shook his head. I've known strong people in my life. I knew Clara, who was strong in her own way, but you're... He stopped because the word he wanted wasn't strong exactly, and he was trying to be precise. You don't make a production of it. You just do what needs doing and you don't need anyone to notice. And I notice. She let out a breath that was slow and quiet. I'm not asking you to be something you didn't come here to be, he said. I know what the arrangement was. I wrote the advertisement. I know what it said. But I think what's here now is different from that. And I think you know it is. And I don't want to keep not saying it. She looked at him for a long moment. What is it? She said. Not challenging, asking him to finish. It's that I'd like you to stay, he said. Not because the ranch needs running or the winter needs managing, but because when I think about this place without you in it, it stops looking like anything worth being in. He held her gaze. I know that's not a pretty speech. I don't have a pretty speech. What I have is that. The fire cracked. The stove ticked. Evelyn looked at her hands on the table. He watched something move across her face. Not the quick, controlled management he'd seen in the early months. Not the careful smoothing over. Something real and undefended. The morning I left Weston, she said slowly, I stood on the platform and I thought, I am about to go to a mountain I've never seen, to a man I've never met, on the basis of a letter that was honest but not warm. She looked up. I wasn't afraid of it being hard. I'd had hard. I was afraid of it being another version of invisible. She paused. Another arrangement where I kept things running and nobody saw it happening. Evelyn, I'm not finished, she said gently. He closed his mouth. You saw it, she said. From the first month, the fence, the flower, the rope, you noticed. You didn't always say anything, but you noticed, and that's... She stopped. For someone who spent 17 years being furniture, that's not a small thing. She looked at him steadily. I made my choice a long time ago, Rowan. I'm not here because I have nowhere else to go. I'm here because this is where I want to be. He looked at her. The coffee, he said. She almost smiled. What? You kept the coffee warm the first week. You didn't have to do that. I didn't ask. It wasn't part of any arrangement. You just did it. He paused. I noticed it the first morning, and I didn't know what to do with it, and I've been not knowing what to do with it ever since. She did smile then. The real one. The surprised one. The one that had sneaked out the first time back in January, and that he'd been watching for since. It changed her whole face, made her look like someone who hadn't had enough reasons to use it. That's when you knew? She said. That's when I started knowing, he said. I'm a slow study. She laughed. The same laugh, low and genuine and entirely itself. I know, she said. I've noticed that too. He reached across the table and she put her hand in his, and it wasn't the half-accidental brush of courthouse fingers or the careful professional distance they'd been maintaining for months. It was deliberate, and they both felt the difference, and neither of them pulled away. They sat like that for a while without talking, and the stove ticked and the fire went and the mountain sat in its enormous quiet outside, and it was imperfect and it was unglamorous and it was entirely true. The summer that followed was the first honest summer Frost Ridge had seen in a long time. Not easy. The mountain didn't do easy, and neither of them expected it. The Attorney General's investigation into Langford's operations opened in July, which meant Pierce wrote letters and Evelyn wrote responses to Pierce's letters, and the paper moved back and forth while the actual mountain work went on regardless. Rowan's leg finished healing with a slight stiffness in cold mornings that he suspected was permanent and had decided to accept. 2 of the cattle needed attention in August. The east fence came down again in a summer storm and required 3 days of repair. Through all of it, they worked the way they'd learned to work. Together, each covering what the other couldn't, without the need for much discussion about who did what. Langford's appeal came through in August. Pierce was unsurprised. Evelyn spent 2 evenings reading through the new filings at the kitchen table with her notes spread out around her, and found what she was looking for on the second evening. He's tried to reframe the 1881 seal as a retrospective restamping, she said. He's claiming the document was recertified in 1881, which is why the newer seal appears. Rowan looked up from the account book. Can he make that stick? Not if we can show there's no record of a recertification process in the county archive. She was already making a note. Tillman will know. That's the kind of thing Tillman tracks. Of course he does. She wrote the letter to Tillman that night. Tillman's response came back in a week, brisk and personally indignant. No such recertification process existed in Caldwell Creek County records. And furthermore, he resented the implication. She passed it to Pierce, who passed it to the appeals court, and the appeal was denied 6 weeks later on a Thursday afternoon while Rowan was fixing the barn door and Evelyn was reorganizing the root cellar they'd spent August digging out and shoring up. Pierce sent a letter. Evelyn read it, came to the barn doorway and said, "Appeal denied." Rowan drove the last nail on the hinge. For good? Pierce thinks so. The Attorney General's investigation makes another attempt significantly more costly for Langford. She leaned in the doorway. He's not done. Men like that don't become done. But we're not interesting enough anymore. There are easier targets. Rowan tested the door. It swung cleanly. He looked at her. You sure? No, she said honestly. But I think so. And if he comes back, we'll be ready. We're always going to be ready now. He looked at her standing in the barn doorway in August light, practical and tired and completely certain, and thought, yes, that's exactly right. The survey came in September. A proper one, commissioned by the county following the court ruling, conducted by a surveyor named Alderman, who spent 3 days on the northeast section with his equipment and his assistant, and emerged with measurements that matched Evelyn's original findings almost exactly. The boundary was exactly where the deed said it was. The fraudulent stake had shaved 43 feet off the true line. Alderman set a new iron marker in the rock face with the precision Tillman would have approved of, and the northeast corner of Frost Ridge was, for the first time in years, correctly marked. Rowan rode out to see it on the day Alderman finished. He stood on that rock shelf above the creek bend, the same shelf where the ground had shifted in April and put him down in the rain, and looked at the new marker. The mountain was copper and gold in the September light, the slopes already turning, the high peaks white again with the first early snow. The creek ran below, doing what it always did. He thought about the 12 years he'd been here, about the silence he'd built, the careful distances, the life narrowed down to what couldn't be taken. He thought about a stagecoach arriving in October with a woman he didn't know, and about all the ways he'd tried to keep that at arm's length, and about how none of it had worked because she was the kind of person that Walls didn't know what to do with. He thought about Clara briefly and without the old weight. He thought, I carried you long enough. You can rest now. He rode home. Evelyn was in the yard when he came back, doing something with the vegetable plot she'd established in the south corner of the yard over the summer. A modest thing, practical. The kind of garden that produced food rather than appearances. She'd coaxed more out of the thin mountain soil than he'd believed possible. She looked up. Well? Good marker, he said. Solid. She nodded and went back to the garden. He unsaddled Buck and stood in the barn for a moment. Then he went to the small shelf along the south wall where he kept the things he'd made over the years. The practical things, mostly. Tool handles, small repairs. A few things that had started as one thing and become another in his hands during long evenings when his mind needed occupation. He picked up the thing he'd been working on for 3 weeks, since the appeal had come through and he'd finally felt the permission to make something that had nothing to do with survival. It was a bluebird, carved from a piece of pine he'd found split clean in a summer storm, the grain of it following the shape he'd found in it. He was not a sculptor and it wasn't a perfect thing. The tail was slightly heavier than he'd intended and one wing sat a fraction lower than the other. But it was a bluebird, recognizably, and he'd put care into it in the way you put care into something you're making for a reason. He'd been trying to find the right time for 3 weeks, which meant he'd been avoiding it, which meant he was still, in some ways, the same slow-moving man who had taken 8 months to say what he felt about coffee kept warm. He put the bluebird in his coat pocket and went back outside. Evelyn was still in the garden. She looked up when he came over, reading his face the way she read everything, quickly and without pretense. He held out the bluebird. She looked at it. Then at him. I made it, he said, which was obvious and unnecessary. and the best he could do. She took it from him carefully, the way you take something that someone made with their hands. She turned it over, looked at the grain of the wood, the shape of the wings, the slightly heavy tail. "It's a bluebird," she said. "I know it's not perfect." "I know." She looked up. "It's better than perfect." He wasn't sure that was logical, but he understood what she meant. "I want to ask you something," he said. She waited. "I want you to stay," he said. "I said that before, but that was about wanting. This is different." He was working through it carefully, the way he worked through the hard fence problems, methodically, without shortcuts. "This is me asking, not from what I need, from what I think is right, for both of us." He met her eyes. "I think we're better at being alive when we're in the same place. I think you know that too. And I think we've been in an arrangement long enough that it ought to be something else by now, if you're willing." She looked at the bluebird in her hands for a moment. "You're asking me to choose," she said. "I'm asking you to say what you already chose," he said. "So we both know." She was quiet for a moment, not uncertain. He knew the difference now, knew that her quiet was almost never uncertainty. It was precision. It was finding the right words for the right thing. "I chose it the morning I kept the coffee warm," she said. "I just wanted to see how long it would take you to ask." He looked at her. She looked back with those eyes, the steady, quiet, entirely unfoolable eyes of a woman who had been watching him find his way to this spot since October, and had been patient enough to let him walk the whole distance himself. "That long?" he said. "That long," she said. He laughed. It came out rough and a little surprised, the way his laughs always came, like something that had to get past a locked door to get out. She smiled at the sound of it. They stood in the September garden with the mountain going gold around them, and neither of them said anything for a while. And it was the best kind of nothing, the kind full of something. That evening they sat on the porch after supper, the way they'd started doing in the spring, with the chairs turned to face the western ridge and the last light burning itself out behind the peaks. The bluebird sat on the porch railing between them. The creek was audible below the pasture, finding its way over the same rocks it had been finding its way over for longer than anyone on it could account for. The cattle were settled. The barn was sound. The northeast marker was in the rock where it belonged. The root cellar was full. The account book, for the first time in several years, showed a number that didn't require revision. None of it had come easily. The legs still stiffened on cold mornings. The root cellar had taken 3 weeks of hard digging. The account book had required Evelyn sitting with him for 2 evenings and reworking the way he tracked expenses, which had been its own small friction. The fence would come down again. The cattle would get sick again. Something on the mountain would always need doing, always be demanding something, and that was not going to change. But Rowan had spent 12 years treating this mountain as a place to endure, and had discovered slowly and with considerable resistance that it was a place to live in. There was a difference. He hadn't understood the difference until someone arrived who knew how to live in hard places. Not bravely, not with dramatic courage, but with the quiet daily persistence that is harder than courage and less noticed and far more sustaining. He looked at the land below the porch, his fence lines, his creek, his cattle moving in the last light, his mountain. He thought, I almost made this into a grave, a very large, very cold grave, and I nearly got comfortable in it. What are you thinking about? Evelyn said. He looked at her. She was watching the ridge, the bluebird in her hand, turning it the way she did sometimes, absently. She'd taken to carrying it in her pocket. He'd noticed. About how close I came to staying this way forever, he said, the way it was before. She thought about that. You would have been fine. I would have been surviving, he said. That's not the same. She turned and looked at him. In the evening light, her face was tired in the earned way, the good kind, the kind that comes from a day of real work on a life that matters. No, she said. It isn't. The stars were starting, one at a time, the way they always did up here where the sky was too big to fill all at once. He'd watched stars come out on this mountain for 12 years and never thought much about it. Tonight he noticed them. You're going to write to that sister of yours, he said. Thomas's sister, in Columbus. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. Am I? You wrote her in February saying you'd arrived safely. She deserves to know you're more than safe. A pause. What should I tell her? He looked at the first stars, scattered and cold and very far away, hanging above the mountains they'd fought through a winter and a lawsuit and a season of slowly finding out what they were to each other to protect. Tell her the mountain is harder than you expected, he said, and that you're staying anyway. She looked at him for a moment. That'll worry her, Evelyn said. Tell her you're staying because you want to, he said. Tell her it turns out wanting something is its own kind of strength. She was quiet. That's good, she said softly. That's the truest thing. He reached out and she took his hand and they sat as the dark came down over Frost Ridge and the stars filled in and the creek kept on with its particular, endless, patient conversation with the rocks below. The land was safe. The storms, for now, were behind them. And the two people sitting on that porch, a man who had spent 12 years learning to need nothing, and a woman who had spent a lifetime being everything to everyone while needing nothing in return, had finally, imperfectly, stubbornly learned the same true thing. That surviving alone is a skill, but choosing someone and being chosen back, and then doing the hard daily work of staying, that's the only thing that turns a piece of mountain into a home. Frost Ridge would see more winters, more fence lines down and cattle sick and roads buried in snow. There would be arguments. There were already arguments, and there would be more, because neither of them was easy and neither of them pretended to be. There would be hard years and lean years and years when the mountain felt like it was asking too much. But there would always be coffee kept warm in the morning, and that, it turned out, was everything.